I see this ending in a very direct way. It's back to the old comment that Napoleon Bonaparte was planning something with his generals and said, "Well, if you do that, the Pope won't like it." And he said, "How many battalions has the Pope?" I think that's the problem right now for the French, the British in particular, the Germans, also obviously the Poles. The Poles, the poor dears, they're sitting right there on the border with Russia, and they have the most to lose in any sort of conflict that would occur. I don't see much evidence that the majority of Polish citizens favor war with Russia. They certainly are not very friendly to the Ukrainians. They've got over 3 million living in their country that they'd like to send back. I guess my view is that Ukraine is going to end much like Vietnam did, not with a bang, but with a whimper. We started preparing to get out certainly no later than 1970. We were largely out of the fighting by 1972, early 73, and we left. And in 75, everything fell apart, and no one in Washington talked about it. And we stopped talking about it, and it went away. That's what we do. When things don't go our way, we fail strategically. We stop talking about it, and we go on to the next opportunity. I think that's what's going to happen in Ukraine. It's just going to fall apart. The Russians will advance. I think they're inevitably going to have to go into Kiev in some fashion. They will definitely go to Odessa. They've got more force concentrations up in the north now. They want to end this thing, but they know they can't just walk out. Although they'd like to walk out and go back to where they were in terms of the areas that they've annexed as part of Russia, but they know that's not possible. So they're going to press forward slowly, deliberately, and wait for things to change in Europe. They've already seen them change in the United States. So they've changed here. We don't want to be in a war with Russia. We've stated it categorically. President Trump wants to restore normalcy with Russia. He's got a Congress that doesn't. But the Congress has no skin in the game. That's our problem. They don't think they actually have to fight anybody. They don't think they'll be at risk or their country will. That's his problem. He has to deal with that. But the Europeans, I think they are going to witness change in their own countries, and that change will facilitate the final end of this mess. But I don't see how we, without the willingness to use military power directly in some fashion, have anything in the game anymore. We don't. In fact, we'd like to get back to business as usual with Russia. I think that's pretty clear.
There's some interesting contradictions, though, with the Europeans, because on one hand, they make the point that they can't accept that the Crimea has returned to Russia, yet they recognize it's not so much they can do right now, but in the future, it can be perhaps reversed. At the same time, they demand a peace agreement, which offers a permanent, sustainable peace. But if you, in this permanent, sustainable peace, if you already make it clear that you're not happy with the status quo and implying that this could be changed in the future with military force, they tend to signal very strongly to Moscow that this would be another Minsk, a temporary ceasefire until we could rebuild. But given that the U.S. is seemingly charting a different path, what does this mean at the end of Ukraine, the Ukraine war? Sorry, is that also the end for NATO in your view?
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. NATO is disintegrating in front of us right now. If NATO were the alliance that we say it is and pretend that it is, then you could have made the decision back in 2022, 2023 to mobilize NATO. You could have summoned all the leadership to the NATO Council and said, we've decided the only way to deal with Russia is to confront Russia militarily. They otherwise will not take us seriously. But nobody wanted to fight. I mean, this is the problem. Anybody who looked at the situation in 2022 understood something right from the beginning. The Russians will fight. The Ukrainians will fight. Nobody else is going to fight. So, under the circumstances, The Europeans should say, we're not prepared to fight. If you're not prepared to fight, shut up and color. Do something else. Put an end to this. I think eventually that logic will win over the Europeans. But again, I see our presence, our influence inside Europe as essentially malicious because we prevent the Europeans from reaching their own conclusions. Because whenever an issue comes up, they turn around and look at us. Well, what do you say in Washington? What are you prepared to spend? What forces are you sending? What are the terms of trade that you're going to give us? How's this work with the EU? You can't just like that and worry about what are truly your own vital strategic interests. So we've got to get out. The problem has always been, how do you do it? And neither we nor the Europeans would take steps to facilitate it. There was always an opportunity to say, well, it's time now. The Soviet state is gone. Let's put in a European four-star. In other words, a senior European general to lead the NATO alliance. Well, nobody in Washington wanted that. They all wanted to be in charge. And we were going to lose general officer slots. Nobody in the Pentagon wants to do that. They want to be in charge of everything. And then they stand around and complain, well, the Europeans aren't spending enough. But if you turn around and say, well, we're going to lead and they're going to leave and they're going to have to, nobody wants that. This is a game. It's over. It's finished. The opportunity to plan this in a deliberate fashion that made strategic sense is over. It's not going to work that way. We're just going to leave. That's coming. Now, I can't say it's next week because we're going to have a fight here. Even though, for instance, because I worked on these things when I was in the Army staff, it's a lot less expensive to maintain your forces here at home and train them and equip them than it is to maintain them over in Europe or Korea or Japan. It is. It's less expensive. So that's actually a tremendous relief financially if you can train here. But nobody wants that. Everybody wants to be everywhere doing everything. Unless if you don't, then you lose overhead, you lose headquarters, you lose generals, you lose spending. Because if you go to Washington and you ask senators and congressmen, what is your job, Glenn? You know what they say? Our job is to spend money. So if we can't spend money, what do we do here? It's true. That's what they think. Well, they're about to reach that point where they're not going to be able to spend money. It's coming.
Well, I think you're right about the danger of always, well, for eight decades, only looking towards the US for strategy, because when you outsource strategic thinking for 8 decades, suddenly there's no more strategic thinking left. And to make matters worse, they also have the EU, which also essentially just makes the elected officials into bureaucrats who implement decisions which have been made already by some outsiders. So the strategic thinking is largely absent, which I think explains a lot of our current problems, of course.
Well, until recently, I always thought the Norwegians were the most sober-minded people in Europe, because I remember asking a brigadier general, his name was Lundberg, up in Mons. He worked with me in Norway, big, tall guy, great sense of humor. And we got into a discussion about the EU and the Eurozone and everything else. And I said, well, how do people feel about Brussels in Oslo? He said, well, the real question is, how does everyone in Bergen feel about the people in Oslo? And I said, what do you mean? He said, nobody in Bergen trusts the government in Oslo. Why would anybody in Oslo trust anybody in Brussels? Well, I thought that was a very healthy outlook. I wish Europeans would start thinking in those terms.
Well, not anymore. The the common sense is long gone, and now that the future with Americans are a bit uncertain, the politicians are pushing very hard for connecting with the EU, so joining the sinking ship, and the resistance by the public is seen as something problematic. They don't appreciate, understand everything as well as the politicians, because the public vote with their feelings, and so even the question of whether or not it should be decided with a referendum can be possibly challenged because, well, again, this is the political elites who knows best, and of
Well,
course their friends in the media.
if you decide that the population is incapable of determining its own future, you're in a lot of trouble.